begins with this verse. Psalm 133, verse 1, behold how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity. Can we agree with that? What a wonderful thing it is when there's peace and harmony and unity. And in the early days of the church, which we've been studying about in our study through Acts, in the early going, there was amazing amount of unity and harmony and peace among the brothers. And so let's go to Acts chapter 2 to just touch on a couple of verses that highlight the unity that they enjoyed and they shared in those early days, even as the church was growing by leaps and bounds. After the first gospel sermon in Acts chapter 2, 3,000 people were added to the number of believers. There were already about 120, so now it multiplied. And we see this description of the number in verse 44 of chapter 2. All who believed were together. They had all things in common. Day by day, they were selling their possessions and belongings, distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. Day by day, attending the temple together, breaking bread in their homes. They received their food with glad and generous hearts. That just sounds like a wonderful thing, doesn't it? Very happy time. Down in verse 32, it says, the full number of those who believed, chapter 4, verse 32. Chapter 4, verse 32. As it continued to grow, the full number of those who believed were of one heart and soul. No one said that any of the things that belonged to him was his own, but they had everything in common. Interestingly, in both places where it emphasizes their unity, it follows that immediately by their sharing. They were united in heart and soul. They had all things in common, and then they shared their possessions with each other. And this is a time of great growth and peace. Even after the ugly episode with Ananias and Sapphira at the beginning of chapter 5, after that, the church continued to grow. And in chapter 5, verse 12, it says, now many signs and wonders were regularly done among the people by the hands of the apostles, and they were all together at Solomon's portico. The number of believers now had multiplied even again to, who knows how many, thousands and thousands. There's some 5,000 men, we're told, of chapter 4. So now it's grown and grown and grown, and yet they enjoy this time of harmony. Down at the end of chapter 5, verse 41, the apostles, after having been arrested and persecuted and beaten, when they were released, it says they left the presence of the council, rejoicing they were counted worthy to suffer dishonor for the name. And every day in the temple, from house to house, they did not cease teaching and preaching that Christ is Jesus. Okay, so you've got this huge group of Christians, and they have all things in common. They're united in heart. They're united in soul. They're sharing. The apostles are working very hard day and night in every opportunity they have, teaching and preaching the word. That's the picture that's painted for us all the way up into chapter 6. We have the first hint of division, the first threat to the unity of the group. And as we'll see, it's over something relatively minor, we might think. And I think there's lessons all over this for us as we currently enjoy a time of unity and harmony. And we're not going through any upheaval that I'm aware of. Everybody's getting along and things are going well, and it is peaceful, isn't it? And it's wonderful. What a blessing it is. We can enjoy that. And yet, most of us have lived long enough to know and to see that sometimes all it takes is a small problem that can threaten the unity of a group. And so we want to learn from the lessons here and how that was dealt with, and a kind of a crisis averted by the apostles dealing with this problem that came up. So in chapter 6, verse 1, it says, now in these days when the disciples were increasing, so continuing to grow, a complaint by the Hellenists arose against the Hebrews because their widows were being neglected in the daily distribution. So we need to really kind of dig into this verse a little bit. What's going on? You got two groups of people that are named here, Hellenists and Hebrews. Now these are all Jews. But the Hellenists, that word is a word that basically describes Greek-speaking people. So these Jews had probably grown up in other parts of the world and had come to Jerusalem at some point. But their hometown was probably somewhere else. And you might recall in Acts chapter 2, even though they were addressing an entirely Jewish audience, they spoke in different languages, and the people said, hey, I recognize that. That's the language they speak where I'm from. And so there were these different languages. There were people there, Jews from all over. Well, the ones that were from these other places, maybe their first native language was their home place where they were from. Maybe they spoke Greek primarily, whereas the Jews who had been born and raised there in Jerusalem and Judea spoke Aramaic most likely. And so they had their own kind of native language. And that sort of was a difference between those who were local, let's say, and those who were from elsewhere. And then on top of that, there were some cultural differences very often. It wasn't just the language they spoke, but this Hellenist could refer to sort of a way of life and a culture. In fact, one commentary says the Hebrews were those Jews more inclined to embrace Jewish culture, were mostly from Judea. The Hellenists were those Jews more inclined to embrace Greek culture, were mostly from the diaspora, those who had been scattered. To oversimplify, he goes on, the Hebrews tended to regard the Hellenists as unspiritual compromisers with Greek culture. And the Hellenists regarded the Hebrews as holier than thou traditionalists. And he grants that this is an oversimplification. But maybe you're kind of getting a picture here of in the Jewish culture. This is, of course, all this existed before the church came on the scene. You had Jews who lived and grew up elsewhere, and you had Jews that were from the home area there, and they looked and seemed different. A comparison I read in another place was the same thing has happened in Israel today, where you have people who have grown up there, and you have Jews who've come from other parts of the world and moved there, and so they come and maybe they grew up in New York or they grew up in Russia, so their first language is where they grew up, and their dress and their culture and their, is kind of different from the people who've always lived in the area around, Palestine and Jerusalem. And so there's that natural kind of difference there. And that's similar to what's going on in this case. So that's this Hellenists versus Hebrews thing that's happening. And where it shows up is they said that the Hellenists, those who were of the Greek-speaking sort, they said that their widows were being neglected in this daily distribution. So we've seen already in the verses we read that they shared everything. They had everything in common. And this reveals that there must have been something along the lines of like a soup kitchen or something, some sort of daily effort to provide food to people who need it. And probably this is funded somewhat by those lands and houses and fields that were being sold. Remember that led up to the events in chapter 5. People were selling property and giving it at the apostles' feet, and they were using that and sharing it. So one of the things that was needed was food for people to eat. And so they had this daily food process of meals, and the Hellenists, the Jews of the Greek kind of culture, said that the widows in their number were not being given their fair share. That was the complaint. Okay, that's the problem. Now let's continue. Verse 2, the 12 summoned the full number of disciples and said, it's not right that we should give up preaching the word of God to serve tables. So you see that we just read at the end of the last chapter how they were completely devoted, day and night, in public, in homes. They were preaching the word. That's what Jesus had called them to do. They had a special mission. And they said, we can't really be distracted from our mission that we've been given. So, they say in verse 3, therefore, brothers, pick out from among you 7 men of good repute, full of the Spirit and wisdom, whom we will appoint to this duty. But we will devote ourselves to prayer in the ministry of the word. It's interesting that they put the crowd in charge of this. And they said, we're going to remain focused on our task, but you, notice it says they assembled the full number of believers. And they said, you choose 7 men, and we'll put them in charge of this. And that was the solution they came up with. And what they said, verse 5, pleased the whole gathering. Everybody thought this was a good idea. And they chose Stephen, a man full of faith and of the Holy Spirit, Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, Nicolaus, a proselyte of Antioch. Obviously, I'm struggling with these names. But one thing that you read is that these are not Jewish-sounding names. In fact, the commentators would say that they all have a Greek-sounding name to them. One note was, these men have Greek names, and it's likely that they all came from the Hellenist wing of the Jerusalem church, though many Judean Jews also have Greek names. So it's not, you can't say for absolute sure, because there were some Jews who grew up in Jerusalem that ended up with a Greek-sounding name. But for all 7 of them to have Greek-sounding names, probably a lot, if not most or all of them, were chosen because they were from this particular crowd where the problem had originated, where the complaint was. They were the very people who had said that our widows are being neglected. And so it says in verse 6, they set these before the apostles, they prayed and laid their hands on them. The word of God continued to increase. The number of disciples multiplied greatly. A great many of the priests became obedient to the faith. Problem solved. Isn't that great? There was this issue that came up. Some people were upset. The apostles had a plan. The plan was put into action. And now the problem seems to have dissolved. Life goes on. They keep growing and everything is wonderful. Awesome. So this is what we hope we can emulate, right? When the day comes, when there's some problem, some issue, something that threatens the unity and harmony of the group, what we want to do is come up with an approach, a solution that we can resolve and address the issue in a way that unity is not compromised and we continue to grow and thrive. That's, I know, what the Lord would want as well, because that's his desire that we would all be united. So let's now think through this a little bit. Obviously, when even it takes a little effort to describe the problem because it's so foreign to us. We don't know what Hellenists are in this context. It's a foreign idea. I mean, we have to do like a little work to kind of describe the problem that they were having. And they had this food distribution sit down. All this stuff, there's very little of it is exactly like what we experience today. So what lessons can we possibly learn from this? Well, I want to share 4 ideas. First of all, that we should beware of the natural fault lines that exist in any group of people. So, if you look at like a stone or a piece of wood or anything, there's these natural, because of the composition of it, most things, not everything, most things have natural lines in it that it can fracture along that line. And what can cause it, sometimes it's like a solid thing, but what can cause it to break, and it'll break right in a certain way, if you know exactly how to hit it just right, in the right place, it'll crack right along that line. Or if it's put under a tremendous amount of stress or strain, if it's going to break, it'll break along that fault line. The earth is even that way. We know this. There's fault lines in the ground. And so in a group of people, there are, I believe, these same kind of fault lines that are there. And maybe everything is fine, but all it takes is just a strike in the right place or a tremendous amount of strain or stress, and you'll start to see those fault lines are going to be where problems tend to begin to happen. And so these fault lines among us would be anything that tends to make us different from one another, things that among which people tend to group themselves. It could be things as simple as age. It could be things like culture, nationality, race, economic status. As we all know, it's as the expression goes, birds of a feather tend to flock together. It's just the way it is. You might think back to high school. Maybe your high school was like mine. I can remember in the cafeteria, room full of hundreds of people, but a lot of times the football guys sat together. And some of us nerdy, geeky people that nobody wanted to sit with sat alone. No, we sat together, but there was just a few. And but anyway, people just kind of like clumped together by what the things they had in common. It just sort of happened that way. And you might even see racial kind of segregation even among everybody that was there. And this is just, the way people naturally do. When you walk into a room or when you're in a crowd of people and you're meeting people and you find somebody and they're like, oh, we're like the same. Then you kind of gravitate toward that person because you can relate to them and you have things in common. And that's not necessarily malicious or evil. It's sort of human nature, right? But so imagine in the church here, you have thousands, they're all Jews. They have a lot in common. But what they don't have in common is some of them probably dress a little bit different and talk a little different. They have an accent because their first language is something else. They're from somewhere else. They're not from here. We noticed it took forever. And I don't even know now, at what, 17 years in, we're probably still not thought of as locals, it seems like. By, it's like you either grew up in Lincoln County or you didn't. And that's the end of that. But, and so I think, the Jews are probably that way too, right? You're either like from Jerusalem and you like your grandparents were from here and we know you, or you are from somewhere else. But those groups had, even though they had naturally been all unified, all it took was some kind of issue, and suddenly you're going to see there's a danger there that there could be a fault open up along this difference. And that's something to be aware of. It's something, because it's so human nature. How can we overcome it? Well, one thing I would suggest that I think is just a very simple thing. It's something that is emphasized 4 times in the New Testament. There are 4 places where a very simple instruction is given, and it is to greet one another with a holy kiss. Now, bear with me. But Paul says it 3 times, and Peter says it as well. Greet one another with a holy kiss. Now, the holy kiss was their way. I think it was an affectionate family type greeting. It's the way you've seen these cultures where they greet each other with a kiss. It's the way you would greet somebody who is family. Why would they emphasize that? Why emphasize to greet one another with like a family type greeting? I think it was because they need to establish and strengthen and maintain these bonds of kinship that they shared together with their brotherhood. So when you come into a place, when you walk into a room, when you're working with people, the emphasis here is don't just immediately look and say, hey, there's my buddy, right? And then spend all the time talking to that person and ignore like everybody else or wherever, because that's what people tend to do. Cliques and all that, right? They tend to sort of find the people like themselves and just associate. But instead, go out of your way to greet everybody and make a connection with everybody. In that way, when we do that, we're sort of reaching across those natural, divisions and building relationships and building bonds, get to know everybody. And it'll strengthen the bond that holds us together so that we don't have this tendency to kind of become divided, because the Lord doesn't want us to be divided. He wants us to be united and held together. And so fight the urge to only associate with and only hang out with and only get together and only talk to the people just like you. That's not a necessarily evil thing, but it is something we have to overcome if we're going to all have unity and be the kind of family that God wants us to be. Secondly, it's interesting, and it was pointed out in one place I was reading that this problem happened right under the apostles' nose. So this point, I would say, beware of blind spots. So how is it that this problem was going on, that you have widows who are being neglected and nobody seemed to know about it until it was brought to their attention? How were the 12 oblivious to this issue that was happening right in their midst? Well, it's kind of easy to see when you think about it. First of all, these people who were being neglected were the widows. Now, all throughout God's word, there is a special emphasis on widows and orphans. It's all through the law of Moses. In James 1:27, we're told pure religion and undefiled before God is this, to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction. God has a special, now why is that emphasized so much? It's because those people, especially in their culture, were very vulnerable. In a world that was really heavily dominated by men and patriarchy, you had to have a man very often to own property. You had to have a man to be the breadwinner. And so when the man died, leaving behind a widow and orphans, then they had nobody to speak for them. They had no one to represent them, and they might have lost their source of income. So they were going to be dependent on others, and even more so than in our society, of course. And they wouldn't have a voice necessarily that would be heard by others. And so you've got widows who already are going to be easily overlooked by just the structure of their society that they lived in. And then on top of that, these particular widows are those widows, these other people who were from somewhere else, who didn't speak the language natively, who grew up talking some other way, it would be very easy for them to not be well connected. Maybe all the local Jews knew their widows and they knew their grandmothers and the people that they had, but these are like some other widows. And so you can imagine if there's any kind of language barrier, if there's cultural barriers, and add all that on top of the fact that they were widows to begin with, and can you see how easily they could have been overlooked or neglected, even maybe without anybody meaning to? Maybe they didn't. Maybe nobody was trying to be discriminatory or insensitive to them. Maybe it just sort of happened naturally because the people took care of the people they already knew, or who knows what. Somehow, though, it was not known until this was brought to their attention. So how can we overcome this? I think we have to, again, be intentional about this and recognize the tendency that we all have to focus on and be aware of the people that we know and have a connection with. Okay, think outside of that. Who could slip through the cracks? Who doesn't have the kind of connections that we would bring something naturally to our attention? And who do we need to think about who doesn't have a voice? Who is the marginalizer? Who are the people who aren't possibly being heard, whose needs are not being met? So that's something that we need to give thought to and look around and say, what can we do to make sure that there isn't somebody that we're somehow not even maybe meaning to, but we're just completely ignoring. And we're all oblivious to it because it's in our blind spot. I think that's also always going to be a danger that's there, and we have to be on guard against it. Happened. Look, this is like the picture of perfection almost, this early church. When you read the description of their unity and their love and their sharing, you think, wow, if we could only be like them, and if this kind of problem could happen right in their midst, then it could happen in any kind of group of people. So that's the second thing. Beware of the natural fault lines. Beware of our blind spots. And the third thing is to listen to complaints. A lot of times in the Bible, complaints are a bad thing, right? We know the people of Israel came out and they grumbled, they complained. Complaints are bad. And it would be easy to just dismiss their concern as, well, don't complain. But the apostles took this seriously. They recognized this was an issue. This is something that needed to be addressed. It was a real concern that these women were not being taken care of. And when that was brought up, the 12, even though when you think about how busy they were, all the stuff they had going on, think how easy it would have been just to let that slide, to not pay attention to it, to not see it as something all that important, to not give it any attention. And I'll tell you, I've heard from people. I know this is felt by some people, that they feel like, maybe you've heard from some people, they say, well, I've been somewhere and I tried to raise a concern. I tried to share what was bothering me. Nobody listened. Nobody cared. And especially if that person feels like they're part of a group that already doesn't really have a voice or isn't, then they finally speak up and say, hey, I need help, or I'm hurting, or something bad is going on, or I feel like this is happening. And then if they feel like the people who have control or who are running things just dismiss their concern, they leave, right? They get discouraged. They feel like, well, nobody cares. And that can happen very easily. But the apostles listened to the complaint. They took it very seriously. Even though they said, we're not going to stop being apostles to take care of this, but they did see to it that it was addressed. They heard the issue. They took action to resolve it. So those people who brought this complaint up knew that, okay, they listen to us and they care about what we're saying, and they're going to do something to make sure this is taken care of. So it's important to listen when people try to tell us something. The fourth thing is to be part of the solution. And I think this is another lesson we can learn from this. The apostles, when they brought this issue to them and they said, hey, our widows are being neglected. And so what they did was they assembled the whole group of people. They gathered everybody together and they came up with a plan that involved everybody. They said, okay, you all choose 7 people, and we're going to appoint those 7 people over this. And the whole crowd said, this is a good idea. And they selected 7 people, and apparently selected 7 people who were part of probably the same population where the issue kind of had arisen. And I think this shows some important things as well. It's easy to spot problems. It's really, really easy to be like on the sidelines and just kind of point out what's going wrong and what people aren't doing right and how the leadership should be doing this and that person failed over there. It's easy to see things that are wrong. It may be even easy to kind of like file a complaint or drop a comment in the box or whatever, and say, hey, the service was terrible. It's easy to sort of point those things out. But when they brought it to the apostles said, okay, now let's fix this together. They called everybody and they said, now we're going to solve this problem. You all are going to choose some people. We're going to put them in charge of this. They said, okay, and they did. And they chose 7 men, and those men could have said, well, this is not my problem, right? But they didn't. They got busy and got involved. Even though they're not called deacons here, this is often looked at as an illustration of the type of thing that deacons could do. They're serving. They're men who are chosen to be over this thing and make sure that it works like it's supposed to. And so they took that job seriously. And it shows us how even some small task, seemingly small task, can be very important in the overall mission of maintaining unity and harmony. And we should not ever think of something as being insignificant or not worthy of our best effort. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 12 and we'll conclude here. 1 Corinthians 12. Something as seemingly small as waiting tables, which compared to the work the apostles were doing, you might think is not that big of a deal. But look at how important it was that they addressed this. Think about how important it was that they got this right, because it was threatening the harmony of the church. And so Paul says here in 1 Corinthians 12, and we'll read 21 through 26. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. The parts of the body that we think less honorable, we just bestow the greater honor. Our unpresentable parts are treated with greater modesty, which our more presentable parts do not require. But God has so composed the body, giving greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. You have all these different parts. Some seem to be more presentable, some more honorable, have a more important job. It actually says they're all important. And one can't say to the other, I don't need you, you're not important. That all the members of the body would have the same care for one another. Verse 26, if one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. Those Hellenist widows who missed out on lunch that day, that affected the entire body, including the apostles. They're all connected because we're all part of the same body. And so we have to have the same care for one another. And every job is important. And even though the apostles recognize this is not our role, we're going to appoint some people to that. Those people they appointed that took that seriously and did a good job of it. And it was all important in maintaining the harmony and growth of the group. So just to reiterate, as we think about this, there's plenty of other ways that problems can come along, but just learning from this example, we need to be aware of the natural fault lines that just exist in any group of people, any kind of things that would tend to divide us naturally, and go to efforts to reach across those and build strong relationships so that those things don't become an issue. Secondly, we need to be aware of our own blind spots. Like, look beyond the people that you would normally think about and think about who else might I be overlooking. And then thirdly, if somebody comes to you with a complaint or an issue, listen to that and see if it's something that needs to be addressed and responded to. Don't just dismiss it. Because sometimes people finally build up the courage to say something and they only feel like nobody listens and nobody cares. And we don't want it to feel that way. And then fourthly, if we're going to be part of raising an issue, let's be willing to be part of the solution. Like, how can I fix this? Not just like, this is broken. Okay, good. But can you help me fix it? Say yes. Because the goal is that we want to work together. We want to solve problems. And we want to be have unity and peace and continue to grow and thrive as God would want us to. Obviously, this lesson has not been about how to become a Christian. But if there's someone here this morning who's never joined the body of believers, it's a wonderful thing. And even though it's difficult at times, the blessings are just amazing. But most important blessing is salvation that comes as being part of Jesus and being in his body. And that overrides everything else. The side benefits of being part of the body of believers are just a fringe benefit. But the main thing is you be at peace with God, have harmony with him, and have hope and forgiveness. And if there's any way that we can help someone this morning with any of those needs, let us know as we stand and sing.